second part, which is on the vasculature. So we're starting with Unit 6, Part 1, which is the anatomy of the heart. Well, your heart's approximately the same size as your fist, and here's its location, although I wouldn't spend too much time studying these terms at all. It's just, that's where it is. It's on certainly left side of your chest. Here we see a diagram showing the location quite well. There's the diaphragm that forms the boundary between the abdominal cavity and thoracic cavity, and there's the heart. And of course the heart is lined by a pericardium. The pericardium surrounds it. There's a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium, which you don't see very clearly. It's not marked in this diagram. There's the apex of the heart. The lungs, of course, have the parietal and visceral pleura. Here you see the diaphragm, skeletal muscle tissue involved in respiration. Let's go into more detail. The covering of the heart, the pericardium, is really covered with it has two major layers. One is a fibrous pericardium, and then there's the serous pericardium, which of course has two serous membranes, the parietal pericardium, parietal layer of the serosal membrane, and the visceral pericardium, which is the visceral layer of the pericardium. It allows the heart to constantly be in motion in a relatively low friction or low resistance surrounding. The two layers, the visceral layer and the visceral pericardium and parietal pericardium, in between there's serosal fluid, so there's a fluid-filled cavity in between. That allows for friction, not frictionless, but very low friction. It says here friction-free, but there is no system that is 100% friction-free, but it's very low friction. Pericardium overall protects and anchors the heart. It really prevents also overfilling of the heart with blood. I mean, there is a certain limit to how much it can be stretched out, and that's prevented by the held in check with the pericardium. Here you see a close-up of this particular area of the pericardial wall. There's the fibrous pericardium, a strong fibrous layer surrounding the entire organ, and then there's the serous membranes, the parietal layer of the pericardium, so the parietal pericardium. There's the cavity in between, this space here in between, and then the visceral pericardium, which is right on top of the heart. All of this material here is cardiac muscle tissue, the wall of in this location, the wall of the heart muscle, and then on the interior side you have the endocardium, which is the internal lining of the chamber. So you have a pericardium, peri meaning around the heart, fibrous pericardium, serous pericardium with two layers, a visceral layer and a parietal layer, then the myocardium, which is the muscle tissue, and then the endocardium, which is the actual inner layer lining the chamber, which really is lined with a simple squamous epithelial lining of endothelial cells. Okay, the wall itself, as I've said and I described to you, as epicardium, the outside part, the most outer part, which is the visceral layer, the serous pericardium, the myocardium, which is the muscle tissue, the cardiac muscle tissue, and the endocardium, an endothelial layer that lines the surface of the myocardium, and it forms the wall of the chambers. Overall, the pathway of blood through the heart is as follows. Blood initially that's being ejected out of the heart to the rest of the body, that carries oxygen to the rest of the body, goes up the aorta, so you have the aortic arch, and off of the aorta are many, many branches that lead to all the different tissues all over the body, in that way supplying oxygen to all of the tissues. When they reach those tissues, they break down, they divide further into, smaller arteries, and then arterioles and smaller arterioles, until finally there's a capillary bed. And there are capillary beds everywhere. This arterial system of the very largest aorta and the largest arteries and the arterioles, all of it is really a conductive system. The only gas exchange that occurs, or any exchange movement of liquid across the wall, is going to occur in the capillaries, and there are capillary beds all over the body. Those capillaries are very thin-walled structures. The red blood cells, just to give you some idea of how small the capillaries are, the red blood cells go through them typically in single file. So you can imagine that there are an awful lot of capillaries all through your body. After all, you bleed wherever you're cut, except for nails or hair, which is dead tissue, or the very surface of your skin, which is also dead. The capillaries then lead to small venules, going to larger venules, and then veins, and they go back to the heart, and they enter the heart into the right atrium. So there's the right atrium. It's receiving blood from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava down here. And that blood goes into the right ventricle on the lower right side. And the right ventricle, the blood goes up out of the heart through the pulmonary trunk, and then the pulmonary arteries up to the lungs. And this part now is called the upper part is called the pulmonary circuit. Okay, all of this. So it goes up to the lungs to get oxygenated, and goes into small capillaries that surround the surface of the alveoli, and that's where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen gets picked up and CO2 is released into the alveolar space and breathed out, and then goes back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, and re-enters the heart in the left atrium, goes down into the left ventricle, and then when the left ventricle contracts, the blood is sent up and out through the aorta again to start the whole cycle again. And all of that is shown here, including the names of the valves, which you need to know. Between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the tricuspid valve. Between the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries exiting the heart is the pulmonary semilunar valve. The blood comes back, goes up to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries, comes back from the lungs to the pulmonary veins, entering the left atrium, and it goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle through the bicuspid valve. So here you have on the right side, between the two chambers, atrium and ventricle, on the right side you have the tricuspid, and on the left side it's the bicuspid. Once it's in the left ventricle, the blood is pumped out of the heart through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and out to the rest of the circulation. And here you see in this diagram that kind of pathway, where you have here the aorta with branchings coming off it, and the aorta turns and goes down through the out of the thoracic cavity through the diaphragm into the abdominal cavity through the descending aorta. So blood comes out, goes out to the periphery, and then returns eventually when it's somewhat depleted of oxygen. Remember, most of the oxygen is actually still there. Only if you're at rest, then only about 25% of the oxygen is taken up in the tissues. It's coming back at a PO2 of 70 or 75% saturated with oxygen. The blood comes back through into the heart through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. There's one more place that delivers blood back to the heart, and I'll show it to you in a little while. But the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava drain the lower and upper parts of the body into the right atrium here, and then it goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then up, going past through the pulmonary semilunar valve here, out of the right ventricle, and up through the pulmonary trunk, which splits into a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery. Remember, it's not what kind of blood, whether it's fully oxygenated, oxygen saturated, or partially unsaturated, but it's a question of, does the blood vessel lead away from the heart? And if it does, then it's an artery. It's called an artery if it leads blood away from the heart. So the right and left pulmonary arteries lead up to the lungs, where the blood gets oxygenated, and then the blood is returned through the right and left pulmonary veins. Fully oxygenated comes, all that blood enters into the left atrium and goes down through the bicuspid valve, which also is called the mitral valve. So bicuspid or mitral valve comes down into the left ventricle. You'll notice that the left ventricle has the thickest cell wall. All of this is the thickest area muscle, and that's because this chamber has to generate the most pressure and deliver blood to the entire systemic circulation. And that blood goes up and out through the aortic semilunar valve, out through the aorta. You can just see the bottom of the aorta here, and it goes out to be delivered to all of the tissues. The atria of the heart are really the receiving chambers of the heart. On the right side, it's receiving blood from venous return from the rest of the body, and on the left side, it's receiving fully oxygen-saturated blood from the lungs. Each atrium has a auricle. On the right side, the right auricle; on the left side, the left auricle, and these act as a surplus receiving chamber to, if the venous return of blood to the heart is increased to fairly high volumes, then any excess will start accumulating in the auricle on the right or left side. There are muscles that mark the walls of the atria. They're fairly large muscles. You'll see them soon. They're also in the ventricles, actually. Blood enters the right atria from the superior and inferior vena cava. I told you that. And then another area it comes from is the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is positioned on the posterior side of the heart. It receives its venous return from the coronary circulation. Every part of your body needs to receive oxygen and rich blood, and the heart muscle is no different, and it has its own circulation. It originates from a branch coming off of the aorta right at the base of the aorta. As soon as the aorta leaves the heart, there's a branch off of the coronary artery, the main coronary artery that supplies the heart, and then all that blood goes through capillary beds inside the cardiac muscle tissue and goes back through coronary veins back to the coronary sinus that then drains that blood into the right atrium. Blood entering the left atrium comes from the right and left pulmonary veins. Right and left pulmonary veins, these are the veins that are bringing oxygenated blood back from the lungs. Here you see the auricle. They're not showing it. Well, they're calling it right atrium, but that's underneath this. This is sort of a external there. Here they're labeling it here, the auricle. This is the left auricle, but all of this here is the right auricle. Okay, and here you see fairly clearly the coronary circulation. There's the left coronary artery, and there's the right coronary artery. They're positioned in these grooves, atrioventricular groove on the left and the atrioventricular groove on the right. This groove, which is, essentially what they're referring to is, I'll do it in a different color, this sort of valley that stretches all along here, and this one that stretches all along there. It's an indentation like a valley on the surface of the surface features of the heart, and just as it says, it is in fact the boundary line between the atrium and the ventricle on the left and the atrium and the ventricle on the right. So right atrioventricular groove here is separating the right atrium and the right ventricle, and on the left side the left atrium and the left ventricle. And that might not be obvious, but it is. And in that groove you have the left coronary artery here and the right coronary artery here. Of course, they split into arterioles and then dive down into the tissues and become capillary beds that allow for gas exchange, and then go back to forming veins, cardiac veins. Here you see left pulmonary artery sending blood out to the left lung. There's the right pulmonary artery sending blood out and up to the right lung. The aorta, which is this largest vessel here. The first part is called the ascending aorta, and then you have the aortic arch, and then the first major vessels that come off, although there is a vessel, as I told you, coming off at the base of the aorta to supply the circulation to the coronary arteries. The first major vessel that comes off right at the top of the arch is called the brachiocephalic artery. And yes, you need to know these terms. There's the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. That region, of course, the right ventricle on this side here. This is the pulmonary chunk right there. Sends blood up to the lungs. Right pulmonary artery sends blood up to the right lung. Left pulmonary artery sends blood up to the left lung. The major vessels coming off the arch of the aorta are the brachiocephalic artery, right there. The left common carotid artery, over here. And the left subclavian artery. So you have left common carotid artery and left subclavian artery. The brachiocephalic on the right side happens to split higher up, and I'll show it to you later. It splits into two major vessels, which are the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Okay, now the ventricles that form the lower chambers of the heart on the right side and the left side, ventricles are discharging chambers. They pump blood out of the heart. They have papillary muscles in the walls and another structure called, well, I won't get into that. But they have papillary muscles on their walls, and I'll show you a diagram of that. The papillary muscles are holding onto tendons that are attached to the valves. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta. And here you see that the right ventricle is there in that area of the heart, and the left ventricle is here. Let's move on. The major external vessels of the heart, and this is the anterior front view, include the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, delivering venous return back to the heart, back to the right atrium. The right and left pulmonary veins, which are bringing oxygenated blood into the left atrium from the lungs, so they empty into the left atrium. Blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart include the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and the ascending aorta, which has branches, the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. There is, by the way, as I said before, a right common carotid artery and a left common carotid artery, shown not on this diagram, but higher up above the brachiocephalic. I'm sorry. There's the brachiocephalic artery, then the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian, and then the brachiocephalic higher up than shown in this diagram will split into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Now, this is the posterior view of the heart, a view which is rarely shown in diagrams and rarely discussed. It's like the dark side of the moon. Now, I told you that there are 3 vessels that bring blood back to the heart, oxygen depleted blood back to the right atrium of the heart, and they include the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, but also there's blood coming back into the heart into the right atrium from the coronary sinus. And again, as I said, the coronary sinus collects blood from the coronary circulation, which is the blood supply to the heart tissues themselves so that they themselves can get oxygen. And there you see the coronary sinus. A sinus is a space, so it's really a kind of a widening of these venous structures. There you go. We're back inside anterior view of the heart. You can see the papillary muscles. There they are, marked. Papillary muscle. They're like an extension of muscle tissue from the wall that's always attached to the valve structure. And the valve structure is made of quite a tough connective tissue strands formed by called the chordae tendineae. So here you see the papillary muscles down here extending from the wall and then attaching to the strands of the valve called the chordae tendineae. And then there's the part, not all, they had to take a part away, but here's one flap and there's another flap. It's open of the tricuspid valve. Okay, so what happens when this opens is because these muscles and these muscles are all contracting. Really, you could look at the papillary muscle and the chordae tendineae, and then it's the same as on both sides. You have the same kind of structures on both sides, the left side also. So So you can look at the papillary muscles, the chordae tendineae, and the valves as kind of, the papillary muscles are the arms of a parachutist holding onto the parachute cords, which are the chordae tendineae, which are attached to the parachute, which is the valve. So when this contracts, it pulls down, holds it tight, again, holds it tight so it opens up, and when they relax, the flaps move back in and close. As I said, there is a coronary circulation that supplies oxygenated blood to the heart itself. It starts as a branch coming off the aorta at the bottom of the base of the aorta. It has one unusual aspect in that it has a lot of alternate routes or additional branching. As the coronary circulation delivers blood, there's a lot of splits, but they don't all wander off in the same direction. They actually sometimes rejoin in. So if blood flow is this way, here's an example of a route right there where the blood can flow back into this route that already has supply there. So there are these collateral routes of the blood circulation. They help ensure that the blood will be supplied to, they don't guarantee, but they help ensure normally the blood will be delivered to every area of the heart, even if a major vessel gets occluded, that means blocked. So if there does happen to be a block in this area here, for whatever reason, then the blood can channel around it through the structure here. And then downstream in this area and further downstream, there will be adequate supply. So there are external vessels that supply and drain the heart. This is the front view or anterior view of the heart. We have the right and left coronary arteries in the right and left atrioventricular grooves that I've spoken about. And there are other arteries which I'm not going to ask you to learn. I would want you to learn the major right and left coronary arteries here, here, no, here, and up here. It splits, of course, into the, it splits once it gets to this point here. There are also veins, and I wouldn't worry about the names of the veins, other than knowing the fact that they all curve around and join up at the coronary sinus, which is on the posterior side of the heart. So all of those veins bringing the return or venous blood from the cardiac circulation all lead back to the coronary sinus, which then drains into the right atrium. Okay. What I've been discussing is shown here. I mentioned particularly the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery, which are found in the right and left atrioventricular grooves. And I mentioned some of the other things that I've mentioned are labeled, but some aren't. I would only want you to know the ones I mentioned. These, of course, all of these, right? And this is the arterial supply. There's the venous supply going back to the coronary sinus. Okay, we're going to stop here. This is the end of Unit 6, Part 1 on the anatomy of the heart. We'll continue in Unit 6, Part 2 with some more anatomy, but also mixing that with function or physiology. And we'll get into heart valves, and we'll end the Unit 6, Part 2 with looking at ECGs.